Good viewer, you are watching Xirtus.
I'll take it. All right, Latterwave. Good to have you, Dave. I'm really excited because you've been on a few times and you're full of knowledge. And every time you leave us with like a little cliffhanger, right? Like the last time, you're like, well, I was just thinking about this whole thing where like Genesis. So I wanted to give you like a little bit more purview to go deeper and all that. Yeah.
That's awesome. I'm thrilled to be back. I don't think of myself as having a lot of knowledge. I think of myself as being very strange.
That's good.
And having weird. I think it's good. I think it's good too.
Well, these people are stranger when you're a stranger, so it'll be great.
Perfect.
You know.
Awesome. Well, let me repeat the point I made last time and make another kind of a weird observation about Genesis 1:1. That's where we were. Is Genesis 1:1. I forget why. I forget the. I forget what the context was that set it up, but if you look at the Hebrew of Genesis 1:1, so this is the English is, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, right? That's it. In the beginning God created heaven and the earth. So the how do you read that in Hebrew? Turns out that there have been other ways to read it besides how we read it. Okay. And those are sometimes pretty interesting. So let me start with, I'm going to come back to Bereshit in a minute. Okay, the first word is Bereshit. And here this translation says it means in the beginning. And that's a very conventional, ordinary kind of translation. Okay, let me come back to it. The second and third word are bara Elohim. Bara is created. Elohim is God. It's one of the names of God. Now there is an oddity here, okay, which is that Elohim is a plural. A thing that is im is a masculine plural, or feminine masculine things together. But the verb is singular. And through most of Genesis 1, in fact, most of the Bible, whenever Elohim comes up, you have this kind of mismatch where the verb is singular, but the noun appears to be plural. And so you say that's a plural of majesty, meaning, look, it's just God. It's one God, right? Sort of conventional theologian would say all this stuff, right? Not created, not, having form or whatever. confounding the substance creedal stuff, right? Okay. But the eam is meant to remind us he's the greatest. It is the greatest. God is the greatest thing. But if you go down to about, I want to say verse 26, so that makes fine. That makes reasonably fine sense for most of Genesis 1. Okay. But later in the chapter, I want to say it's verse 26, it suddenly doesn't make fine sense anymore because there it is. It is verse 26. Look at that. God suddenly becomes plural. Let us make mankind in our image. This is still Elohim, right? So suddenly God plural, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness. That's plural.
This guy's talking to himself.
That's, I think, this is exactly the question. Who is he talking to, right? And by the way, he makes them male and female, and that gives, there's like a whole other set of questions. Well, what does that mean? Well, one way to understand that is that the us included male and female beings, and so we're making Adam and Eve in our image, man in our image. There's males and females, some things, right? And so we make Adam and Eve male and female to replicate those male and female somethings. Other readings have included the idea that before Eve was extracted, that Adam was a hermaphroditic being. That Adam was, all you trans kids, you're not making it up. It's old as old. That Adam was man and woman at the same time.
Yeah, right? That rib. There's some fun translations to that rib. That's what, you know.
So how does this? So how do we understand Genesis 1? So I jumped into the chat to leave a comment. I don't know, a couple weeks ago on this point. There is an old reading, and I came across it in the. I've recently been reading a book called the Bahir, Bahir. It's a very old Jewish mystical text. Exactly how old these books are difficult to know. This is post Old Testament, but it's probably sort of as early as some reasonably early rabbinic literature. The Bahir, that's it, the Sefer Bahir. And it's sort of 200 numbered sections of interesting kind of mystical paragraphs.
So the Book of Illuminations, huh?
Yeah, Bahir is illumination. Yeah. And in there, and I forget what number it is, but somewhere in the book in the Sefer Bahir, there's this statement that some read Genesis 1:1 as follows. Okay. Bereshit, in the beginning, we're going to come back to that because there's more to say about that. Okay. Bara Elohim. So the standard reading is, in the beginning, created God the heavens and the earth. But some people, according to the Sefer Bahir, read the subject not as being Elohim. The subject is not Elohim. What is the subject? Well, the subject is an unexpressed he built into the verb bara. This is just like you could do in Spanish, right? You can say hizo, he made, or he did. You don't have to say el hizo, right? A lot of languages are like this. Hebrew is like this too. The idea of he is already built into that verb bara. You don't need it. Okay. So that reading then says, okay, what does this say? What does Genesis 1:1 say? It says, in the beginning, he created gods, the heavens, and the earth. And gods, Elohim plural, become a thing that are created in the beginning. Okay, in day one.
I got a picture of Yoda. That'll help some people here. It's basically Yoda speak. You know what I'm saying? Like he's going from saying basically the idea that the beginning created gods. It's the beginning creating gods right there.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so let's come back to the beginning in a minute. But this might answer the question: who is the we in verse 26? Right. Like one reason why you might choose to read verse 1 this way is to say, well, God's not talking to himself like a nutter. Okay, so he's talking to somebody who, well, God is talking to the gods. the Elohim, the divine being, the B'nai Elohim of Deuteronomy 32:8, the sons of God, right? Deuteronomy 32:8 says the sons of God divided the earth, or God divided the earth according to the sons of God. And so that answers that question. And now it raises the question, well, who is he?
Right.
Who is he? And the Sefer Bahir says it's the Ein Sof, meaning without end. So that sort of suggests there are divine beings, but there is one who is, the endless, the one without limitation or boundary, and that is the being, the power that we should understand as existing truly from the beginning, and that power created gods. And then there's a conversation about let's create man, right? Again, that is a way that some people have read the same Hebrew Bible that was used to translate the King James or the New International Version or whatever.
Right. And it's it's the direction that they would actually read it. So who is the Bashir following? Which groups are there particular?
Man, that's a good question. The Sefer Bahir is, I'm way out of my depths here. I'm going to say stuff and people are going to be like, no, Dave, okay, but I'm going to say some stuff anyway. So if you say, I want to read Jewish mystical texts,
right?
You tend to get pointed at three big ones. One is the Sefer Yetzirah, which means the book of creation. The Sefer Yetzirah, I'm going to characterize this really broadly, is I just reread it. It's so interesting. It doesn't feel like a book that you're meant to read. It feels like a book that you're meant to basically do. And so it's actually quite short. It's like a few thousand words. And so you read like R.E.A. Kaplan. In fact, this blue cover you're seeing is the copy I have, R.E.A. Kaplan's. Not that one, like the one down across the middle of those images. That one. Yeah, this is the edition I have. Most of it is actually Kaplan's commentary, because the Sefer Yetzirah is something like, there's multiple versions, but it's like 3,000 words. Now, you don't think in word count, that's like 12 pages. Like if you just read the text, it's like short version 10, long version 20 pages. And this is quite old. This is I think it's as old as the sort of beginning of rabbinic literature, and some people think that it preserves ideas that go back to First Temple Jewish priests. So the stuff that was in the Sefer Yetzirah may have been passed down verbally or in some other form, and then was put in the Sefer Yetzirah about the time that during those first generations of rabbis, something like the 2nd century AD.
And so this is supposed to be, Bara is creation. So this is the book of creation.
Yeah. So
kind of Genesis.
Yeah. So it talks its way around. Man, I'm gonna characterize this terribly again. But so that image, the Sephirotic tree, the 10 Sephirot, right? So it sort of sets that out and expounds it in various ways. And what it really contains are a bunch of exercises to spiritually empower you, to connect you with, to embody in you the Sephirotic tree. So the Sephirot are the circles there, okay? And each of those is like a concept or a power. And you can see that there are 22 lines connecting them, and each of the lines is getting one of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet on it. Okay, and so the Sefer Yetzirah is a bunch of, really it's a bunch of exercises for meditative practices to empower you spiritually, using basically that diagram as a kind of a map. Okay, so it's like, so the kind of Hollywood cliche of an Indian spiritual guru, right, is kind of like, meditate upon my chakras, right? That's kind of what it is, because it's kind of like, look, going along all of the various sort of potential patterns of the tree, you get different combinations of letters, and applying different vowels to them, you go through and you recite the different all of the different consonants in order using different vowel patterns, and it's a spiritual practice, and the point of it, which, man, I think a real mystic would deny that you can even say what the point is. So, like, I'm already like way off base, right? But you are you're getting away from your conscious mind and connecting with the other parts of your psyche, the other parts of your spirit, with your unconscious mind, with I'm forgetting which of the Sephirot it uses, but it's like connecting with your Chokmah instead of with your Bina. I think Bina is like the sort of left brain focused intelligence, and I think it's Chokmah, the parallel on the other side, is it's kind of the right brain, unthought intelligence, right? Like without unconscious right decision making. So that's the Sefer Yetzirah. The Sefer Bahir, Sefer just means book. So Book of Creation, Book of Illumination is a little later, which because it refers to the Sefer Yetzirah. Still quite old. And then the third thing is the Zohar. And man, the Zohar is pretty big. I have a little version that I think Gershom Scholem maybe did, a little paperback. It's not even it's like a super abridgment. It's like an excerpts from. And so I'm not even going to attempt to tell you what's in the Zohar, frankly.
Yeah. Well, one of these days we'll get you on with David. Our friend David's been transcribing the Zohar with some old rabbi for like decades, so he'd be a good talk for that, probably.
I am super interested in hearing that.
Yeah, so, I mean, they're definitely the pillars comes up. The veil and the pillars are the things that he keeps going on about particularly.
Jewish mysticism has is the sort of heart of it, the image heart of Jewish mysticism always tends to come back to the things of the temple, right? So the 10 Sephirot are the tree of life, which is the menorah. But you also hear the phrase Merkava mysticism, which is Merkava, the Ark of the Covenant is God's throne. We think that because in the Old Testament, Yahweh is described as being Yoshev HaKeruvim several times, meaning literally what it says is sitter of the cherubim, or sitting the cherubim. So we read that as meaning the one who sits between or sits above the cherubs. And the idea is that the ark, the ark was his throne, but in Chronicles, I want to say 1 Chronicles 28, I could be wrong. There's one verse that refers to it as his chariot, his Merkava. So there's the Merkava mysticism is a mystical practice, again connected with the idea. Yeah, there it is. He gave him his plan for the chariot, which is the Ark of the Covenant. So, and so there's an interesting connection with that, by the way, in the story of Jonadab ben Rechab. He gets referred to in the book of Jeremiah. I think there's a reference in the book of Kings also, though. Jonadab ben Rechab, which means Jonadab, son of the chariot, right? Like sometimes people's names don't look like names; they look like they mean something else.
Interesting.
And there's this promise that his people are said to live in tents and drink no alcohol, and there's promise that they'll never lack a man to serve in the presence of the Lord, which sounds like a sort of a temple promise of some kind, I mean, the whole tents and chariots, and
right. Tabernacles.
Yeah, we don't know very much. That's basically all we know about him. But there's this connection with the idea of the chariot as an object of mysticism. There's a body of Jewish literature, and I well, let me come back and make a very broad comment afterwards, but called the Hekhalot literature, Hekhalot. Hekal means palace. It is a word that also is used to name the temple. Altogether, the whole temple is called the Hekal, or the middle room is called the Hekal. Okay, it's a word that means big building. Literally comes down from Sumerian, and this is another strain of Jewish mysticism. I frankly don't know the difference between Merkava and Hekhalot mysticism, really, or if this is like out on the fringes of Dave's stuff here, right? But Hekhalot means palaces, and these are books that are heavenly ascents, like Third Enoch, classically, or there are various apocalypses, and they're sort of later than. They tend to be kind of later than the Mishnah or the New Testament, kind of late antiquity or early Middle Ages.
The Sword of Moses, huh? There's a book about Moses with a sword. Is that right?
That is interesting. I was having a super interesting conversation about the Sword of Moses with a Jewish friend of mine last night, actually.
Really?
Funny coincidence. Yeah. Maybe
you don't have to skip into it, but yeah, come back to it. I'm kind of curious.
Yeah. So the Sefer Behir is one of these, right? So like the question of like what people, like who is reading these? That's an interesting question. I don't think it's like you would go to, that's the Jews of Arizona or the Jewish people in Smyrna.
Fair, yeah.
I think it's more like, disciples around the teacher kind of thing is my guess, because I think that's how mystic practice usually
particular schools, right? So some of these though are like from Babylon, like the after this first temple, like this one they're saying was connected to the Gaonic period, or the period when they're in Babylon, when they're in Exilarchs. Some of these are a little bit later. It looks like some of these were right before Christ, but also it's interesting that they would be spread around in the 15th century a lot, because that's when copy machines are being made. That's a job that Jews can have, right? So they're going to be printing books, and that would be a decent time to proliferate those kinds of books, right? And that information.
And they're illiterate people, right? They have a paucity of books where intellectual activity is a way to worship God.
Right.
Yeah. So that's one interesting thing about Genesis 1:1, that maybe some people thought that the big God, the main unreachable God, created first the gods, then the heavens, then the earth. There's another interesting thing, and it's in that first word, Bereshit. So Bereshit is conventionally translated as in the beginning. It's got three parts. We read from right to left, right? So it's the first letter is B, and it means in, but it also means with. Okay, it can mean with, like a tool, like he hit me with a sword, or it could mean with like a companion, like I went there with somebody. Could mean either of those. Okay, or in. So the second part is Reish, which is Reish. Rosh is your head. Okay, Rosh Hashanah is the head of the year.
Skull, yeah, like a rose, a blossoming skull, right?
Yeah. So and then eat just means feminine. It's like an A ending in Spanish. Okay, eat is a feminine. So what does Bereshit mean? Well, it means in the feminine, in the principal feminine one with the principal feminine one. Okay, something like that.
Right. Yeah.
It doesn't actually have an explicit reference to time. And so not everyone has read it as being a reference to time. So For example, the Jerusalem Targum. So the Targums, what are the Targums? The Old Testament is basically written in Hebrew, right? A couple of the books are in Aramaic, but mostly it's Hebrew. But when the Jews move out to other places and start speaking other languages, they need Bibles for the synagogues that they can read. So the Targums are translations of the Torah, especially, right, of the parts of the Bible for daily use, especially by Jews who are not trained priests or scholars. They're literate, but they're literate in, say, Greek. Okay, so the oldest, a very valuable old translation of the Bible is the Septuagint, which was made in Greek in like the 3rd and 2nd century BC. It's in the Greek language, but it's made in Alexandria and Egypt. And so there's a big, rich community of Jews who speak Greek, and they get the Bible translated into Greek so they can use it. And the Septuagint is wonderful because it preserves sometimes old readings that disappeared in the Hebrew version. Okay, we touched a bit on that when we talked back about the Deuteronomist. That was a thing that came up. The Targums. So arguably the Septuagint is actually a kind of a Targum. Okay, but it's sort of a Greek Targum. Targum usually is used to refer to the early Aramaic versions of the Bible. So Imperial Aramaic is a language used in the Babylonian and Persian empires before, like everyone speaks French, and they used to all speak, or they speak English now. They used to speak French. They used to speak Latin. They spoke Greek. There was a time when every educated person in the Mediterranean spoke Aramaic, Eastern Mediterranean, right? This was the lingua franca.
Right. And for the most part, like but Hebrew was almost like a dead language simultaneously at that time. More people were speaking, even the Hebrews were speaking Aramaic.
Yeah. Or a provincial language limited to relatively few people, right? So if you're a reasonably rich Jewish community living in Asia Minor or something, you're probably using Aramaic, and so they get a bunch of Aramaic Bibles made. Okay, so these are again old translations of the Old Testament into Aramaic for the sort of daily or more frequent use of Jews who don't speak Hebrew. And they sometimes preserve some interesting ideas, okay, that tell us things that these Jews understood about the Old Testament, okay? And one of them, the Jerusalem Targum, translates the first verse as with wisdom, Elohim. Actually, it says
so straight up calling. Wait, when it says Bereshit, it calls Bereshit
with wisdom. Yeah, it says Bahukama. It's right. It translates it into Aramaic as Bahukama. So what does that mean? So it seems to be the case that the translator of the Jerusalem Targum understood the principal feminine one to be something like the main female angel or the main female divine being, and said, "Oh, well, that's wisdom. I know who that is. That's wisdom, Bahukama."
I think I'm having some internet trouble. Give me 1 second. Can you continue on without me while I fix my internet?
Absolutely. So now, by the way, this is not unprecedented, because in Proverbs 3, okay, Proverbs 3:13 to 18 is a famous passage about wisdom. Okay, and it is a passage where there is a pun on the name of Asherah in verse 13. Ashrei, the man that has wisdom, that finds wisdom. Okay, Ashrei is the happiness of. But commentators say, hey, this looks like a pun on the name of Asherah. Asherah, who is a Semitic tree divinity. Okay, a tree goddess. Why? Because in that same passage, Proverbs 3:13 to 18, blessed is the man who finds wisdom. Why? Because she is a tree. She's a tree of life, and blessed is the man who can grab her. And then in verse 19, in fact, here, I'll pull this up, make sure I get this right. And Andreas has popped away, so he cannot help me. But Proverbs 3, verse 19.
Here, I think we're going to be okay. I'm sorry about that.
Okay, it's all right. So verse
3, verse 19.
Verse 19, yeah, says, by wisdom, the Lord.
I'm gonna turn off my camera and see if that helps.
Okay. The Lord by wisdom hath founded the earth. Now, by wisdom is ba, okay? It's that same one-letter word that can mean in or with. The Lord, with wisdom, bahokmah is the Hebrew, founded the heavens and the earth, right? And so the Targum translator seems to be looking at Proverbs 3 and Genesis 1 and understanding that they mean the same thing, and that wisdom is a divine being. And by the way, maybe understanding that wisdom is the same thing as the tree of life, okay, which is what Proverbs 3 seems to say. So those are two different versions. Again, looking at the same text we have, two radically different ways to understand it. With wisdom, God created heaven and the earth, where God has wisdom as a companion, female divine being, the principal female one. And in the beginning, he created God's the heaven and the earth. By the way, you can of course put them together, right? You could say with wisdom, he created God's heaven and the earth. I don't know that anyone has done that, but the option seems to be clearly on the menu, and maybe it's only a matter of time. Maybe I am now creating this interpretation. All right, I think Andreas is struggling with technical issues. He's not in his usual studio. Oh, here we go.
Do you think that it could be? I'm sorry, I'm trying. Yeah, it's pretty brutal. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
No, it's hello. I think so. The idea that it's you said benesit shokma or be shokma benesit. The idea that by wisdom it's created, and the idea that it's a singular feminine kind of implies that wisdom is kind of part of the Lord, right?
Or is this companion, right? So bereshit. So Proverbs 3:13 or verse 19 says the Lord. And that's I'm looking at a translation, but it's all caps, so that almost certainly says Yahweh. Bahokma, with wisdom. So that could be the Lord with wisdom as his tool, but it can also mean the Lord with wisdom as his companion hath founded the earth, right? Hath founded the earth. Now that doesn't have to be what that means, right? Because the rest of
that's interesting. The idea of the Elohim. I'm sorry, yeah. I've got like internet from India all of a sudden, but so it sounds like you're saying that it could be that it's the father and the wife, or like the masculine and the feminine aspects of reality,
right?
Which is interesting because the fact that we're even divided kind of implies that that's part of what God is made of originally, is like a relationship. So the entire thing.
Absolutely. And this is a very sort of polytheistic reading of Genesis 1, right? But the point is, these are two different components. One in Targum, Jerusalem Targum, kind of says, hey, it seems to imply God is not alone sexless. God is there, male with a female, right? And then the Sefer Bahir says, the God beyond, the endless God, created all the other gods before creating the earth. And there was some controversy, by the way. There are again recorded in the Sefer Bahir, which maybe I should have tabbed these and brought down with me, but I didn't. Sayings by different rabbis about when the angels were created, right? And some said, on the 5th day, and some said on the 6th day or on the 7th day. But what they all agreed is there's no way they were created on day 1, right? which is to say there's a backlash, there's a rejection, there's an awareness that one could read the creation story in Genesis 1:1 as indicating multiple divine beings participated in creation from the beginning, whether it's a great female divinity / angel or a bunch of angels together, and an insistence that must not be true. That, the angels were created later. Why? Well, because the angels fly, and so God created the angels when the flying things were created. Or the angels are lights in heaven, so when he created the lights in heaven, then he created the angels. And those were after day one, safely away from the creation, right? Because that's a reaction that wants to say there's no way anyone helped in the creation. It's just God. God is alone. Bam, the creation. But there's this interesting fact that you can read Genesis 1:1 differently, and some Jews anciently did. Let's see. Tell you what, I don't know where to go with this, but I am looking at the chat. We'll see if we get any questions or objections we can address. The earth is made by wisdom without her husband knowing. Will, that sounds about right. Yeah. Well, that is an idea, right? Is are we talking about God's wife? So there are a couple of archaeological sites. If I were Andreas, I'd pull them up and show them in the chat, but I'd show them on the screen, but I'll put them in the chat instead. You can look these up on Wikipedia. Kuntalet Adrud and Khirbet El Kom. Okay, and I'll let you look them up, and you can check me on this stuff. That's not QUM, it's QOM. Khirbet El Kom. So Kuntalet Adrud is in the north of Sinai. They used to say, "Oh, this is probably a temple." I think the conventional wisdom now is we don't know what it is. There's some building, and it dates to a little bit before the time of the prophet Isaiah. Or I want to say it's early 8th century BC. Okay, like between 800 and 750. I could be wrong, something like that. It's a little before Isaiah. Kuntalet Adrud. And there are pithoi at Kuntalet Adrud, and I believe there are two of them. What are pithoi? A pithos is a big clay jar. So there are clay jars at Kuntalet Adrud that have pictures on them, and the pictures look like people seated on thrones and other kinds of sort of provocative images. And there are inscriptions that refer to Yahweh. I think it's Yahweh of Teman and his Asherah. Okay, Yahweh of Teman and his Asherah, and Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah. And again, at least one of these appears to be under a picture, like it's the caption describing the image. Okay. Now there were debates about what this meant, but I think where the debates have come down is this. Okay. Raphael Patai in his book, The Hebrew Goddess, said this, and I think this is it's difficult to argue with fundamentally. There were some Jews in the 8th century BC who thought that it was natural to present Yahweh, that's the God, the Lord of the Old Testament, together with Asherah as a married couple. Now you can argue about it. The grammar is a little funny. There's a scholar named Margaret Barker who's a Methodist who thinks that because the name appears in the form Ashrata rather than Asherah, that Ashrata was the kingdom of Judah's particular name for the goddess that was known as Asherah elsewhere. Maybe. It's also grammatically a little funny that what you have is a possessive applied to a person effectively, right? It's kind of like my wife's name is Emily. So like Dave of Provo and his Emily is a little weird. Okay. And so there's an argument that this is not a reference to, this is not showing Yahweh as, together with Asherah, the goddess, but Yahweh together with a sacred tree called the Asherah. But that doesn't really get you much gain, does it? I mean, if you say that Yahweh is appropriate to associate with a sacred tree called Asherah because it is connected with the worship of Asherah, that's not, it's sort of potato, no real difference between that and saying, well, this is Yahweh the God and Asherah the goddess, and they go together, right? So there's this kind of funny grammatical question. Maybe Margaret's right, Ashrata is the right name, but it seems quite clear that from Kuntal et Adrud, we have these two inscript, or I think they're ink writings maybe on Pithoi, showing that some Jews before the time of Isaiah thought that Yahweh belonged with this goddess Asherah. So this is we're talking about, is this God and his wife? This is the point. Maybe it is God and his wife. Maybe the Jerusalem Targum is in the tradition of people who said from at least the time of Isaiah, God had a wife, and that's okay. That's normal, right? And obviously not everyone who wrote or edited the Old Testament felt that way. Khirbet El Kom is an archaeological location near Hebron, so it's in sort of Palestine occupied territory. Actually, I don't know if it is now. Maybe the Israelis have taken it back. I don't know. And it's a grave, and I think it's a grave of a man named Uriyahu, as I recall. And there's an inscription on the wall. It's like carved into the wall, and it's a little hard to see because the wall is cracked and that's interfered with some letters. But again, everyone, the way they read this is it's blessed be Uriyahu by Yahweh and his Asherah. Again, and I think it might say Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah again, but blessed be Uriyahu by Yahweh and his Asherah. And the Khirbet El Kom inscription is dated a little bit later. It's dated to, as I recall, the late, again, you guys got Wikipedia, you can check me. I'm just holding it for it till Andreas gets back. I think it's late 8th century, and it says the same thing, right? That this Uriyahu, whoever was putting inscription in his grave, thought it was appropriate to, ask for a blessing upon the dead man from Yahweh and apparently Yahweh's wife, Asherah. So that's interesting, Chad. So you're saying maybe Asherah is not a first name. That's a super interesting idea. So your point is, so maybe this is not the point you're making specifically, but the grammatical oddity, maybe the oddity of having a possessive on a personal name is resolved if we understand that Asherah is not a name, but it's something more like a title. Like it means like his queen, his goddess, right? And so Baal can have an Asherah and Yahweh can have an Asherah. I think Andreas is watching and saw that comment, that super chat, and pushed it through to make sure I saw it. That's awesome. That's a great comment. I don't know if that's your original idea or someone else has made it, but I think that's very interesting. The roots for the name Asherah, by the way, are interesting. I'm going to throw these in the chat. It's Aleph Shin Resh. Okay, Aleph is a glottal stop, but you get two big ideas out of that root, and one of them is happy, and one of them is straight. Okay, including the idea of upright. So when, for example, in Isaiah 40, which the early Christians quote about John the Baptist making straight the paths of the Lord in the wilderness, and by the way, the Dead Sea Scrolls people quoted it about themselves. Okay, they're using that verb yashru, make straight. So Asher is the one who makes straight and the one who renders happy, and it might be a title. That's a super interesting thought. I like that very much, Chad. So all right, let me grab other comments here. Scrolling up. This is the spot where the red heifers are. Is that Khirbet El Kom? That'd be a funny kind of historical audit. That's a place punching above its weight if it gets to have the Kirbet El Koma inscriptions and also the red heifer. That's the idea I'm trying to articulate. Yeah, similar to Mary or Mariam. I do think Mary is a title. Probably means Lady of the Sea, which in itself, like, that starts to sound like a goddess kind of title, especially if the sea is one of the sort of enemy gods. It is. Yam is the sea. Yam the sea is one of the enemy gods Baal has to defeat. If Yam the sea is one of the enemy gods that Yahweh is thought to defeat, if, for example, in Exodus 15, the Song of the Sea, which has been recast to be a story about the Egyptians drowning, trying to cross the Red Sea, and then we run into this temple imagery. Bitter waters turn sweet by the tree of life. By the way, fun fact, Chad, you'll like this. I read this in the Behir last week, and it's like, how did I miss? I read this before, like 10 years ago. How did I miss this last time? It talks about Exodus 15, and it says the etz, the wood that Moses put into the water, was the tree of life. The Behir says that. That's not in Exodus. The Behir says that, which is they might as well be quoting Dave Butler at that point. Okay, but even better, Chad, you're gonna love this. The Behir says, but then Satan stole the tree of life. He moved it so the Israelites couldn't find it. So yes. So the point is, hey, that Song of the Sea seems like, even though it's sort of turned into this story of crossing the Red Sea, but then temple imagery about the water of life and being among the 70 Elim, which sounds like the 70 gods or the gods of the nations. Probably originally it was a story about Yahweh defeating enemy gods and then building the temple out of their bodies or on their heaped up bones or something, right? You kill the enemies and you make the mound of creation out of them. This is, Israel has more than one creation story. This is one of them. Okay. This is sort of one of the public creation stories, and it pops up in the poetic books like the Psalms or like in Exodus 15. Yam probably is one of those enemies. So Mariam, Lady of the Sea, might have a connotation sort of mythologically of connected with that defeated enemy god, and then, coming over onto my side. But the fundamental reason I think it's probably a title is not only is Miriam a prophetess explicitly in the Old Testament, and we see her operating, again, Exodus 15, the Song of the Sea, as Moses's peer, right? She's the counter to Moses. Moses leads all the men of Israel in the song and the dance. She leads all the women of Israel in the song and the dance. And the way it's written now looks like Moses has all the lines and she gets like a couple of lines. But the way we're supposed to understand that is Moses does the thing, Miriam does the same thing, right? So Miriam is a prophetess. There are curious associations of her. It seems so. A way that scholars commonly read a number of episodes in the Old Testament is as sort of mythologized or dressed up accounts that are described as the biography of early leaders of Israel, but really are about the struggles among different groups of priests late in the kingdoms of Israel or just the kingdom of Judah. And Miriam, sort of her story ends in some stories that sort of sound like they're meant to dishonor her. She objects to Moses's marriage, and she's wrong, and she is thrown out of the camp. But even when she's thrown out of the camp, she is white as snow, because allegedly for a disease, but there's this memory of her associating with whiteness. And she's cast out for 7 days. So she's associated with whiteness and with the number 7. And there again, we're talking about like the tree of life as as a woman. Also, when she dies, I want to say it's at Kadesh in the Book of Numbers. I don't have Andreas here looking all the stuff up for me now, but Israel runs out of water, and Moses has to bring water out of the rock by striking it, which tells us that in the sort of the mythological language that's being used here, that Miriam is the source of water. Miriam, the lady of the sea, is the fountain of life. Okay, she is the water that
Does
in
it work now?
Revelation.
Am I back?
You are back. That in Revelation 22 flows out
Oh
from
my gosh!
inside the throne
Sorry.
of God. So Miriam is the water, is the tree. So yeah, and by the way, then sorry, I'm going to finish this thought, Andreas, and then you're back. There's just so many Marys.
Please God do, yes.
and there's so many Marys in the New Testament. It just seems improbable that there are that many Marys. You know, who anoints him? Who is at the crucifixion? And different gospels have different kinds of Marys, and sometimes we seem to be talking about his mother, and sometimes we seem to be talking about his wife. And so I tend to think that Mary was probably a priestly name for some order of priesthood that we haven't really lost. It was, I think, suppressed. I think it was taken away. Yeah. Andreas, how you doing? You're up in that cabin, and they lied about how good the
One
internet.
thing I was thinking about was like the Persian pronunciation.
Oh, interesting. Tell me.
Yeah, you can feel the internet's getting cold in the lines. It's good as long as it doesn't get too. If the internet freezes, that's the problem, you know. But the Mahadevi, because Mary, if you pronounce it in like the Persian, you don't pronounce the R, so the R has this apostrophe sound instead. So it'd be like Mai or Mariam, like it's a lot of the time the way they pronounce it. So it's interesting to me, like the Mahadevi is also kind of connected to this idea of Asherah, that there's a feminine. I mean, So what do you think about that? This idea of before the flood. How much do you think these stories were that connected? I'm pretty interested in the Hindu mythology, especially considering it from the Genesis perspective of the beginning created the gods, right?
Yeah. So when you say before the flood in the Hindu perspective,
is my internet gone again?
No, you're back. Are we talking about here, like, there is in Hindu story an idea that the world is very, very old and has gone through lots of cycles? Is that kind of the idea you're pushing towards, Andreas?
Well, I can see that as a big part of it too. But just the idea of like when people say there's such a big difference between the East and the West because there's many gods, but the Ten Commandments says not to have other gods before me, which implies there are gods. Now we're reading Genesis to say that Elohim is plural. They're talking to each other. It even says the beginning is creating the gods, essentially. It seems like there's even less of an argument between the two. So the idea of cycles then is interesting because that is a big part of the celestial plan.
Yeah. I think look, there's a lot of hints at polytheism, and you can have different feelings about it or different views about it. But I mean, I was just reading. I just read a commentary a couple weeks ago on First Isaiah, and it talked about the Nehushtan, and it said, "Hey, what is the Nehushtan? The Nehushtan is clearly a minor fertility deity from Judah's pantheon that has kind of been lost." Okay, like that's just no nonsense. Just that's what he said.
Okay.
Yeah.
But definitely not Shaitan. Shaitan. Okay, Neshutan. Okay.
That's an interesting question. Have you and I talked about the Nehushtan before? I don't know if we did or not. Did we talk about that? We talked about Deuteronomy?
I don't know if we brought this up yet, but it's on my eye. I mean, like, we've talked about Deuteronomy, but I forget if we brought up this particularly. This is something that's also interesting to me because of medicine, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the idea that Isis uses the Nehushtan staff, that she injects like two snakes, which look like the double helix. I think who's the guy who found discovered the double helix, right?
Yeah. You talking about
Crick
DNA,
or something? Double
yeah,
helix.
Francis Crick and Watson. Is that right?
Watson, right? Yeah, and they were Rosicrucians, and they were really interested in the double helix
Oh, were
because
they?
of
That's
ISIS, and
fascinating. I didn't
I
know
think
that.
that's kind of Yeah.
That's cool.
Right. So like the symbol itself, like it predates.
Well, okay, so let's talk about the Nehushtan.
But yeah, I don't know where you were going with it.
No, that's interesting. I don't remember. I've had a lot of conversations in recent weeks. Let's talk about it. Nehushtan is one of my favorites. It's super cool and super weird. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to at a certain point, I'm going to veer left and go, and in the Book of Mormon. Okay. So I'm going to do that at a certain point, but let's start not there. So, the Nehushtan. Okay. Not first, 2 Kings 18:4. 2 Kings 18:4 is the first passage I want to look at. So 2 Kings 18:4 is about King Hezekiah. King Hezekiah in verse 5 is described as being one of the best kings that Judah ever had.
Still on 56K.
Here, I'll drop these in the chat. People can look them up themselves. 2 Kings 18:4. So, and I'll pair. I know these verses well enough. Okay, 2 Kings 18:4. So, verse 5 says he was the best king who ever lived in Judah. Wow, what for? Well, for what he did in verse 4. Now, one of the things he did is in the middle of his verse. It says he brake in pieces the brazen serpent that Moses had made. For unto those days the children of Israel did burn incense to it. He called it the Nehushtan. Now, he called it the Nehushtan probably means he called it. In other words, that's not its proper name. We don't know its proper name. Okay. This is probably an insult. And what it means is something like brass thingy, snake thingy. Okay. Now, why does he not like it? Well, he says, unto those days, the children of Israel did burn incense to it. Okay. Now, by the way, Moses made it. So the Kings acknowledges Moses made this thing. What's the problem? Well, it got crazy. The children of Israel burned incense to it. Well, where do the children of Israel burn incense to things? Where does that happen? Turns out that happens in the temple. There is an incense altar in the second room of the
tabernacles
temple.
And temples,
Yeah, in the tabernacle, the first room, the holy place, the tabernacle, or the second room, the holy place, or the Hakal. There is an incense altar, and you burn incense there. Okay, so this Nehushtan, a brazen serpent, was in the temple, and they were burning incense to it, and that was bad. And therefore, Hezekiah smashed it to bits. And verse 5 says, and he was the best king Judah ever had. Hamana, what a guy. Okay. Now, let's take a look at Numbers chapter 21. Numbers 21 for the story of the Nehushtan. You'll notice the Nehushtan doesn't appear actually anywhere else. The rest of these passages we're going to read, the word Nehushtan does not appear, because probably that's an insult that King Hezekiah made up, okay, or the people around him, or the editors of the book, or something. Numbers 21, I want to say verses 6 to 9. So is the story of the Nehushtan. So here I'm pulling up mine so I can read if you're having difficulty with connections. So verses 6 through 9. Verse 6, there it is. The Lord sent fiery serpents among the people. Fiery serpents is Nechashim, that's serpents. Seraphim. Now, if you go, Dave, Seraphim, hold on. That sounds like seraphim. It doesn't sound like
right.
It is seraphim. Okay. So serpent seraphim. He sent fiery snakes among the people. They bite them, people die. This is the problem. The problem, Andreas, is mortality. Okay. Snakes are bringing mortality. They're bringing death to the people. Therefore, they come to Moses and said, we have sinned. Pray unto the Lord, Yahweh, that he will take the serpent. It's Nachash. And take the serpent away from us. And Moses does it. Verse 8. Now, this is where this translation, and this is true of the King James translations and lots of translations, okay, tells a little bit of what we would call in London a porky. Okay, a little bit of a porky here, by which I mean a lie. Because it says, and the Lord said to Moses, make thee a fiery serpent. That is not what the verse says in Hebrew. In Hebrew, it says, the Lord said unto Moses, make thee a fiery one. Make a seraph and set it upon a pole. And everyone that is bitten looks upon it, upon the seraph, and it shall live. It doesn't say serpent in that verse at all. It says seraph. Now that's super interesting, right? Because if God says in verse 8,
Yeah,
make
because it's
seraph,
like an angel, but you make
right. Well, so then whatever Moses does in response to this should tell us what he thinks a seraph is, right? So verse 9, what does he do? He makes a serpent of brass. Now this is a pun, by the way. A serpent is nachash and brass is nechoshet. So it says he made a nachash nechoshet and put it on a pole. And if a snake, a serpent, a nachash bit anybody, he looked at the nachash nechoshet and he lived. Okay, and so Hezekiah is apparently mocking that pun, right? Calling it a nehushtan, a brassy, snaky thing. Okay, but what we learn from this is God didn't say put a snake on a pole. He said make a seraph, and Moses put a snake. This tells us that seraphim.
Well, he put a brass thing up. I mean, this could be a lightning rod, right? Like this could be like one of those Franklin rods for electrocutes everybody in a grounding range. I mean, it looks like a serpent. He's saying it looks like a serpent, made a serpent of brass, right? So even that question, like a serpent of brass, is seraph, right?
This is okay. So
really.
This is super interesting because you're saying, hey, there could be technological uses here. Man, yeah, I don't know what I don't know, right? Here's the story. The story says you're bit by a snake. You look at this seraph on a pole, and it saves you. Okay. All right. Obviously, the next passage we have to read is Isaiah chapter 6. Okay. Isaiah chapter 6 is the calling narrative of Isaiah. So this is a vision. Okay, and I'll read this and I'll walk through. I'll kind of comment on this. Okay, we'll discuss. So in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw also the Lord, it's Yahweh, sitting upon the throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. So we're in the temple. Okay. Now we're seeing stuff like, for example, throne. Now, what is the throne? Well, the throne of God is the Ark of the Covenant. We already talked about that, right? Now there may or may not also be a serpent throne on top of that, but the point is there's a piece of furniture, and it's understood to be spiritually God's throne, right? So Isaiah is seeing in his vision the spiritual nature, the spiritual counterparts of things that are physically there, that physically belong in the temple. So there's the throne. Above it stood the seraphims. Now, here we go, right? Because we know that when God said to Moses, make a seraph, he made a snake. So above it stood the seraph. So these are snakes. But first, let's go above it. Above it's interesting. Above what? The English is tricky. It looks from the English like there are three possibilities. There are only two. Okay. So it is not the train in verse 1. Why? Because the train is actually a plural. Okay. It's shulayo and it's his skirts. By the way, in the Old Testament, who wears shulayo skirts? Well, priests do and women do. So God here is either a priest or a woman or both. Okay. But the skirts is not the thing that the seraphim are above. So it can either be there is no it in Hebrew. There's masculine or feminine things. Okay. So it can either be the Lord or it can be the throne. Now, that doesn't make a difference here, right? Because the Lord is sitting on the throne. So the seraphim are above the Lord sitting on his throne. Well, the Holy of Holies is where the throne is. So if the seraphim are above the throne, they're coming out of the Holy of Holies. Okay, so that's what he sees is now, by the way, seraphim, how many of these are there? The least two, right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There's many. It probably at least two.
At least two, because
Okay. At
verse
least two,
3.
though. We don't know that it's many. It could
Yeah,
be.
we don't know there's many. Seraphim is plural. Verse 3 says one cried unto another. So there's at least two. Okay. So commentators have suggested, hey, this is a vision of real physical things, but we're seeing their spiritual counterpart in the temple. What is the real physical thing whose spiritual counterpart Isaiah is seeing here? Well, he's seeing seraphim. And so the real physical thing is probably the Nehushtan. And that means there were probably two of them. There were probably two Nehushtans. And where did they really belong? Well, they really belonged in the Holy of Holies, because that's where they're coming down from. By the way, now this, Andreas, maybe goes to kind of some of the comment you were making. That may connect them with the staff of Aaron, because Aaron throws down his staff and it turns into a snake. And Hebrews 9:4 says that staff is kept inside the Ark of the Covenant. So maybe the Nehushtan are the staff of Aaron. So,
like the serpent is a staff, and it's something kind of techno-magical. But also, I mean, it's kind of this idea that there are two. I mean, is it weird to say, okay, these two seraphim with 6 wings could be like Jesus and Lucifer? Or is that just as quick as possible?
That's exactly right. That's where we are going. That is where we are going.
Jesus with 6 wings is cool, right? Okay, I really want that. Like, I don't have any problem. Like, as long as I can shake his hand. If he has 6 wings, that's cool.
Dude, that's where we're going. You can shake his hand. So that verse, that same verse, verse 2, right, says he has 6 wings. They come from above the throne, and they have 6 wings. Now, by the way, verse 2, they're seraphim, so they're burning ones, and we know they're snakes. They are burnt. They're flaming. Andreas, Jesus is a flaming 6-winged flying serpent. Okay, this is literally the image we're being given here. By the way, if you look down to verse 6, he also has hands, so you can shake his hands because he has them. Okay, now this is not the way we usually think of angels. So let's set aside Jesus for a minute. We're going to come to Jesus. Okay, we're going to come to Jesus, you and I, Andreas.
This is so metal, right? This is metal on every level. Exactly.
This is super metal. It's going to get metaler between now and when we finish. Okay, this is awesome. So, first of all, we don't think about angels this way, right? But just remember that the standard first message that the angel gives when it appears to human beings is fear not. And that only makes sense if angels are in fact terrifying, right? They're not cute little babies. They're not pretty women, right? They're not handsome men in modest clothing like Mormon art likes to depict them. They are apparently, among other things, I love that, 6-winged fiery serpents. Now, we're going to get to the Jesus part. We're going to get there, but we're not done with Isaiah 6 yet. So we get back into Isaiah 6. Here, I'll pull up my own copy so I can look at it too. There we go, Isaiah. So
I hope it's working, man. I mean, it's great. Like, I figure as long as we got the chance, let's put up Isaiah as hard as we can in front of as many people as possible.
Okay, good. Isaiah is the best. Isaiah is the best. So the seraphim are talking to each other, right? So yeah, they have 6 wings. Okay, 2 cover their face, 2 cover their feet, with 2 they do fly. By the way, Andreas, is probably not feet, because feet in the Old Testament is a very common euphemism for genitals. So probably the snake is covering his modesty. So like you see that in like it's Isaiah 10, where the king of Assyria will have his head and his feet shaved to humiliate him. It's not his feet. When Moses forces Zipporah to circumcise, Ruth and Boaz.
Sorry.
No, that's awesome. That's exactly right.
That's a fun one. I always had a feeling, you know.
Yeah. So they have slept together, and then Boaz has to cover his feet. It's not his feet that they're covering. Or when
Yeah.
Moses has their child circumcised, Zipporah is mad and throws the foreskin at Moses's feet. It's not his feet. Okay. So the snake is covering its modesty, okay, and is flying along. Now, by the way, look at they're singing this, the Trisagion, holy, holy, holy is the Lord. And look at verse 4. The house is filled with smoke. Well, why is the house filled with smoke? Well, the answer is because they're burning incense. You're in the temple, there's the incense altar, you're burning incense. This is the Nehushtan, and Isaiah is burning incense to it. He is doing exactly the thing that apparently caused Hezekiah to get upset and smash the Nehushtan to pieces. Okay? The Nehushtan are in the temple, and Isaiah is burning incense. Okay? So this goes back to like our Deuteronomy discussion. Man, the Bible.
Yeah, is this something where he's like, no one should do this, or only angels should do this? Like, who does he think's allowed to do this, or is it just never should be done?
It's a good question, because he doesn't say Hezekiah barred the door or restricted people from going in. It says he smashed it to pieces, which rather implies he hated everything it symbolized, which we're not done yet with all the things that it symbolizes, right? Because so look now, verse 5, Isaiah 6:5, verse 5 there. Isaiah is sad. Why? Because he has sinned. Verse 6, then flew one of the seraphim unto me, having a live coal in his hand. So this is a fiery, six-winged flying snake with hands. Okay. Picks up a coal with tongs. 7, laid it on my mouth. This has touched thy lips. Thine iniquity is taken away. Thy sin is purged. This is metal. This fiery, six-winged flying serpent with arms saves you from mortality. It solves the problem of mortality. When a snake inflicts mortality upon you, this snake saves you, and it also purifies you of sin. Purges you of sin. Okay? This is the thing that Hezekiah smashed to bits. Now, if we go look, you said, hey, it's not Jesus, is it? It's Jesus. How do we know that? Because take a look at John chapter 3. Yeah, take a look at John chapter 3. John chapter 3, New Testament.
I was just thinking about John 3 today.
John 3 is awesome. Nicodemus coming by night. Verses 14 and 15. Okay. So this is John, right? It's not a CCTV recording. It's John, right? Writing, but the words he puts into Jesus's mouth. He says this. Jesus is talking to Nicodemus, and verse 14, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness. That's the Nehushtan. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. Who is the Son of Man? Jesus is, right? Whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have eternal life. So John has Jesus saying, this is the one.
So that serpent's key.
That serpent is key. That serpent is
the Nehushtan.
That's right. The serpent is the Nehushtan. The serpent is flying six-winged fiery metal serpent Jesus, because Jesus says so. Because Jesus says so. Now, by the way, here's the Book of Mormon connection. Oh, actually, we'll look at a couple of verses, but first, let me tell you this. We have looked at both of the explicit references to the Nehushtan in the Old Testament. Numbers, 2 Kings. That's it. By the way, I think Isaiah is also a reference to the Nehushtan, but it doesn't say that. Okay. But it's the seraphim, so I think it is. But that's it. Okay. There's also one.
Right, not technically.
Yeah, there's one reference to the Nehushtan in the New Testament, and we just saw it. So if some of you were going like, what is this Nehushtan crap? I've never heard of it, and I've been going to church my whole life. It's not in very many verses. Okay. But now,
see, like, and wouldn't Stone Cold Steve Austin have been so much cooler if it was John 3:14 on the back of his head?
On the back of his head. That's all. People are like, what? The Nehushtan? Yeah. So
yeah, because like it was like John 3:16, but before that, you know.
But exactly. Thing one. I'm gonna say three things out of the Book of Mormon, then I'm gonna go read Genesis with you. Okay. Thing one out of the Book.
Where we go first.
Okay. Here's like this is just general observation. one clear reference in the New Testament, two clear references to the Nehushtan in the Old Testament. In the Book of Mormon, 4. So, like, fun fact, the Book of Mormon is obsessed about some things. Tree of Life, Adam and Eve, Garden and Eden, Melchizedek priesthood, and the Nehushtan. Okay, where it talks about those things all out of proportion to the Bible, New and Old Testament.
Wow.
So yeah, 1 Nephi 17, 2 Nephi 25, Alma 33, and Helaman 8. They all say basically exactly the same thing.
First
Nephi. Well, let's just go
Nephi 17.
Yeah, let's just look at one. Let's look at if we're gonna pick one, I like Helaman. Helaman 8. Helaman 8.
Helaman 8.
Here. Am I allowed to share? I can share. Or Helaman 8 versus.
Yeah, go right ahead. That might be easier.
All right. Let's see. Do I have a share button? Bam. I have a present button. Share screen. Okay. Screen sharing tips. Cool. Oh crap. I have to go give permissions to Google Chrome. All right. Before next time, I will give my permissions. So here we go. Helaman 8 verses 14 and 15, I think it is. Yeah, 14 and 15. So this is Nephi. There's lots of Nephis in the Book of Mormon. This is Detective Nephi. My friend Aaron was joking around. He's like, man, I'm going to write a Book of Mormon book one day. I'm going to call my book Second Nephi. I said, been done. He said, Third Nephi. Man, you got to keep going. There's a lot of Nephis. So this is Nephi, who is a detective, and he's dealing with the corrupt leaders of his day. And look at verse 14 and 15. The he here is Moses. Yea, did Moses not bear record that the Son of God should come? As he lifted the brazen serpent up in the wilderness, even so should he be lifted up, who should come. Jesus is the serpent. And as many, and now we kind of take one step further, and as many as should look upon that serpent should live, as many who look upon the Son of God with faith, having a contrite spirit, might live even unto a life which is eternal. Right? So all 4 Book of Mormon references basically are this. They all 4 say, look, Jesus is the serpent. Jesus is the Nehushtan. Never uses the word Nehushtan. So this is the kind of thing that, man, scriptures are long and they're complicated and you can read right past it. But so that's thing number 1.
But I mean, it's just crazy because someone would read this and be like, oh man, serpent. But then you look at, like, again, the ancient Torah, or even again, we talk the Veda, all these ideas of God being associated with the master of the serpents. And what is a serpent? Because serpent and dragon and dinosaur, and it has wings, right? There's a lot of birds. Like, we have a lot of different references all of a sudden.
Yeah.
That is this Nehushtan.
Well, and there was, so I had a moment when I kind of was putting some of this stuff together. It was years ago. I am now old. When I was a younger man, and I was like, wait, the scriptures say Jesus is a serpent. Like, that's weird. You know, it bothered me because the scriptures also say that that Satan is a serpent. And you kind of go, ugh. But remember, first of all, like, remember our discussion about the Deuteronomists. The way I read Leviticus 16 and the Day of Atonement is you have 2 goats, and one of them is the Lord, and one of them is Azazel, the rebel leader. Like, those are in some sense twins, right? Jesus and Satan. And one is cast out and one is sacrificed for everyone's sins. Here's another, the 2 serpents thing. Now, by the way, 2 Nephi 18 2 Nephi 2 verse 18 is a Book of Mormon reference that shows just very clearly that the Nephites, who very specifically know that Jesus is the Nehushtan, also know that Satan is a serpent, right? So 2 Nephi 2 is Lehi. It's part of his extended farewell address. He's talking to his son Jacob, and he says, because he had fallen from heaven, he is an angel who falls and becomes a devil. He had fallen from heaven and become miserable. He sought everybody else's misery. Therefore he said unto Eve, yea, even that old serpent, who's the devil, the father of all lies, eat the fruit and you will not die, right? The Nephites know Jesus is a serpent. They tell us 4 times. They know Satan's a serpent too. Now, One more Book of Mormon verse, and then I want to take you into a thoroughly metal rereading of Genesis 3. Okay, but it's the Book of Mormon verse that sets us up. So 2 Nephi chapter 9. If you can just jump to chapter 9 from where you are. 2 Nephi 9. I want to say it's verse. I want to say it's verse 9. Let's see if that's right. Yeah, it is verse 9. Bam. Okay. So
wait, go back. There
you are.
Okay. And verse 9.
In verse 9. So this is now Jacob, Lehi's son. In 2 Nephi 2, Lehi is talking specifically to his son Jacob. Here's Jacob now delivering a sermon many years later. And it's on this, again, I said the Book of Mormon is obsessed with subjects like the Garden of Eden. Okay. And this is a sermon that's full of Garden of Eden talk. And let's look at verse 9. And our spirits must have become like unto him. So this is like if Satan wins, if Satan gets his way, okay? Our spirits must have become like unto him. We become devils, angels to a devil, to be shut out from the presence of our God, and to remain with the father of lies in misery like unto himself. So again, we're talking about that fallen angel who becomes the devil. It's the father of lies, the same figure here, right? Yea, this is the key bit here. Yea, to that being who beguiled our first parents. So this is Eden, right? Serpent beguiled me and I did eat. That's Eve's explanation, Genesis chapter 3. That being who beguiled our first parents, who transformeth himself nigh unto an angel of light. Okay. Andreas, in Isaiah chapter 6, what does the angel look like? Right? It is a fiery six-winged serpent.
So fiery.
So here's the deal.
Also, now I'm scared to shake his hand if he has a burning hot coal in his hand, by the way. I didn't know that was part of the deal.
It doesn't seem like a very good test. Like it is like, okay. So the transformation is the beguilement. Okay? Because Jesus in the Garden of Eden, which is the Holy of Holies, is the serpent with 6 wings, the fiery serpent who saves you from mortality and purifies away your sin. Satan, when he comes into the garden, takes on that form to deceive Eve and Adam. The beguilement is the transformation. The transformation into the serpent form is the beguilement. Now, let's look quickly at Genesis kind of 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Really, we're just going to read some verses in 3. But if you look at Genesis 1, okay, across those verses or chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, you get 3 different names of God. And secular Bible scholars will say something like, hey, these are from different sources. And in one source, it's Elohim, and in one source, it's Yahweh. And this tells us we have different sources putting stuff together. I think there's a better explanation for that, okay? At least in this case. Genesis 1, as we've already discussed, is all about Elohim. It's all Elohim this, Elohim that. Every occurrence of God in Genesis 1, right through about Genesis 2, 4, is Elohim. Okay, Elohim, translated God, maybe understood as the gods, fine. Genesis 2, about verse 4 or 5, we suddenly change names. And the name we get is the Lord God. And Lord in the King James is all capped. And Lord, when it's all capped, means it's translating the tetragrammaton, the 4-letter name of God, Yahweh. Okay? So see how it says Yahweh God, Yahweh Elohim. Okay? And that occurs, that starts in Genesis 2 verse, what is that? 4. Okay? So in other words, we've been talking about Elohim. Suddenly in chapter 2, verse 4, Yahweh Elohim shows up. Now, by the way, what does that name mean? Well, it could mean Yahweh the God or Yahweh of the gods, right? But it's the Lord God, Yahweh Elohim. Now, what does Yahweh Elohim do? Well, he does everything for the rest of chapter 2, which means he causes it to rain and the plants come up. He forms man out of the dust of the ground. He plants a garden eastward in Eden. He plants the trees in the middle. He plants the trees in the garden, but also the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life in the middle. He takes Adam and puts him in the garden. He says, don't eat the tree. He says, hey, you know what? I should make another one of these. And so he pulls the rib out and makes Eve. He brings animals around and they name them, right? All of that stuff is done by the Lord God, Yahweh Elohim. Now,
but they're always really specific. They're constantly being like, here he is, Yahweh Elohim al Haratz, like the Yahweh God on the earth, Yahweh,
yeah,
the tetragram. It's not ever just Elohim at that point.
Yeah, that's right. Now this is going to matter. Okay, chapter 3. Now verses, verse 1 says the serpent is the most subtle of the beasts the Lord God had made. And then suddenly, for the next 4 verses, the second half of verse 1 through 5, we switch back to Elohim. Now I'm going to come back to this. Okay, there's a reason why for these 5 verses we're suddenly talking about Elohim. So they eat the fruit, and then look at verse 8. We're back to Yahweh Elohim, the Lord God. What does he do? Well, he's walking out in the garden, and he detects that they're hiding, and he calls and says, what is the deal, my dudes? And they say, well, we are naked. Oops. Who told you were naked? And this is where we get the serpent beguiled me, and I did eat. And then we get the cursing scene, which we're going to come back to. And then God feeds Adam, or references at least what they're going to eat, right? Eating bread by the sweat of your brow, clothes them in garments of skin, and cast them out. Okay. Now we don't have to look at it, but in chapter 4, it switches again to a different name of God. Genesis 4, suddenly it's all Yahweh, Yahweh, Yahweh. It's like it's just a different name of God. Now what's going on here? What is going on here? Why does Lucifer, the serpent, the beginning of Genesis 3, suddenly stop referring to Yahweh Elohim, right? 2 solid chapters of Yahweh Elohim did all this stuff. But when Satan talks, he says, hey, hath God said you shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And she has this conversation. She says, yeah, well, God said you can't or you'll die. Oh, well, God doth know that in the day you eat, you will become as gods, right? Why is Lucifer not referring to Yahweh Elohim? Why is he still talking about Elohim? Here is what I think is the answer, Andreas. Okay. This is metal, and it's going to get metaler. Okay. The God of the garden is Yahweh Elohim. The garden is the Holy of Holies. Yahweh Elohim, Jesus, is the fiery 6-winged snake of the Holy of Holies, of the Garden of Eden. In order to beguile Eve, Satan has transformed himself to appear as an angel of light. That's what Jacob told us. What does that mean? He has transformed himself. So Satan too now has 6 wings and is a fiery flying snake, so that he looks like Yahweh Elohim, the God of the garden. So when he comes and he talks to Eve, of course he's not going to refer to Yahweh Elohim in the third person, because then he would sound like he's crazy, right? Here I am, Yahweh Elohim. Did Yahweh Elohim treat you to tell you not to eat the tree? No, Yahweh Elohim knows, right? Like that. So instead, he pushes the dialogue kind of back and says, well, he's presenting himself as Yahweh Elohim, as the angel of light. And he says, hey, didn't gods, the gods, yeah, they told you not to eat, but the gods, Elohim, They lied. You're not going to die right away. You're going to become like one of them, knowing good from evil, right? He has to say Elohim because if he says Yahweh Elohim, he breaks his own deception, right? Now, here's the
Right.
here's the medalist part. The curse. Okay, the curse. What are we, verse 14 or something? And the Lord God said unto the serpent, because thou hast done this, thou art cursed above all cattle and above every beast of the field. Upon thy belly shalt thou go, and dust shalt thou eat all the days of thy life. Right? Now, open any biblical commentary, any commentary in Genesis. It will say something like this. The Hebrews believed that serpents used to have feet. So what they're imagining here is that God made Satan's feet come off, or the serpent's feet come off, and he became a serpent. Wrong. The serpent, transformed nigh into an angel of light, had wings. So what this scene is, okay, and what we're missing, what is not expressed, but what must be here, is that Satan is pinned by some of the sort of burly warriors of heaven, okay, and when Yahweh Elohim, the true fiery flying serpent, says, "Upon thy belly shalt thou go," they are ripping off his wings, right? Ripping off his wings, ripping off his arms. Dust shalt thou eat all the days of thy life. And then they throw Satan, who assumed this body as a disguise, right? And now it's been shorn of all of its power. It can't travel. It doesn't have the modesty it used to, right? It doesn't have the fire, and he's cast down. It's the opposite of Adam, right? Adam is brought out of the dust. This divine being, this fiery six-winged serpent, is ripped of its divinity and hurled into the dust, shattered and bleeding as a curse and a punishment. That is what we are supposed to be seeing here in Genesis chapter 3.
That's the best so not everyone can convince me that the snake in Genesis is even related to Lucifer, but that's the best argument I've heard for the fallen morning star, right? That is everything, the connection then to the OU morning star who is fallen. Like, that is exactly what we're talking about then in Genesis, which is pretty interesting. And this is a major confusion for people, that they don't understand that lizards and birds are all dragons. Really, it's the same. If you look up birds on Wikipedia, it's theropod dinosaurs. So there's just one huge family of things, and they were all simultaneously interacting with them. They're going to look at lizards differently. But again, also the idea of Moses' sword, right? Because the idea that Moses' staff and this bronze thing that he's lifting up, is that related in your mind to Moses' sword? Do you think that is the Nehushtan? Is Moses' sword Nehushtan, or is that different?
So Moses' sword. So that is super interesting. I'm going to fail to report this. I'm not going to pass on this conversation very well. I had this great conversation with a super sharp Jewish friend. And
it's a good place to cook. We can cook on these thoughts,
Yeah. And he was talking about swords and the idea that a sword is a common image, or is it maybe not common, but is a repeated image in Jewish mysticism, and it means something specific. Okay, so and the reference he gave me was the Exodus 17:13. Okay, and which is here's what the King James says. And Joshua discomfited Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword, with the edge of the sword. So, and this is understood to be the sword of Moses. Okay, is this sword with the edge of the sword, and so the edge in Hebrew is pei, which actually means mouth. So literally, if you're looking at Exodus 17:13, and Joshua discomfited Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword, it's with the mouth of the sword. And so there is this idea, again, in some Jewish mystical texts, and it might be the sword of Moses, right? This is how we landed on this particular strand of this conversation, Andreas. And Andreas has been pulled off by his internet again, I think. Is you looked up, you were looking at Jewish mystical texts on Wikipedia, or you clicked through some series of articles, and there was one named the Sword of Moses, which I have not read. I don't know what's in the Sword of Moses. But the idea of what the sword of Moses might be, or other named swords in ancient scripture, sword of Goliath, for example, is one. In some ancient texts, there is a sword of Adam. Okay. In the Book of Mormon, there are two named swords. There's a sword of Laban, and there's a sword of Ammon. Those are interesting names. Laban means the white one. Ammon is a very old name. It's an ancient Egyptian god, meaning something like the hidden one. In fact, the god Amun arguably is something like an idea of monotheism from super, super early times, that Amun was like the real god, and all of the sort of various theriomorphic deities were sort of symbols, or they were manifestations of Amun in kind of the local totemistic appearances, right? Shapes. So the idea of the named swords, like the sword of Moses, or the sword of Ammon, or the sword of Goliath, or the sword of Adam or Laban or whatever, is that those were mystic words. They were words that were embedded in the text, maybe near where the sword appeared. And so the story of Moses and the Israelites defeating the Amalekites, or the story of Nephi chopping off Laban's head, okay, or Ammon chopping off arms at the water of Sebus, could be read at a surface level, the Peshat level, or if you look deeper, you might find indications of a word in the text that was understood to be a word of power, which is key to I'm really out of the edge of my knowledge or beyond it now, but words, maybe to circle back around, words that should be used in meditation and contemplation to increase your own spiritual power, right? So that beneath the surface, the peshat, the child level, the simple story level, the idea is that if you master the spiritual discipline of the sword of Moses, then you would have the power to discomfit the Amalekites, right? Or you could be Ammon at the waters of Sebus, or David defeating Goliath, or whatever, in some kind of metaphorical way, if you master the spiritual keys. So what is the sword of Moses? I don't know, but I think that there are some people who've had the idea that it's a sort of a word of power, a word of mystical and spiritual value that could give you personal power when you mastered it, and that it's maybe buried there in the text in Exodus 17. And I am sure.
I know my internet is just so amazing right now. But I was going to say, I read part of the Sword of Moses, and so the idea was that it's you've got the sword as a metaphor, but it's that, even in the wiki they'll say it uses his sword, right? And this is, again, like the Hebrew definition of sword. We're going to have to talk about like what that actually has to do with the Zohar probably next time, though, because I don't think my internet will survive it. But the idea that he goes through these heavenly realms and angels, right? So kind of, and describing various prayers and invocations and ritual procedures. So using his sword, in order to get through all of these realms, which is kind of exactly what you're saying, right? Like this is exactly the way the sword of Laban's described. What it's for, it's in very Thundercats. The sword's not just used to murder.
Thundercats, ho! I mean, that's interesting because we're talking about the idea now of an esoteric word as a password, right? The idea of heaven as the ascent is that you it's not enough to pass the test of Ma'at. It's not enough to be able to say, look, I'm a decent person. That's essential, and also you are required to have some kind of heavenly knowledge, which is commonly expressed as or understood to be knowing past words to get past all of the guardian angels or the monsters or through the gates. You are having awesome internet tonight. You are. But I wonder if, and I haven't looked in the chat for like an hour now.
Yeah, it's brutal. It's pretty brutal.
Is it?
I get the feeling, though, it's all about what you're supposed to say and not what I'm supposed to say anyway. But this was pretty good. I feel like what we'll do is we'll get some more internet together and then we'll continue this conversation because it's been pretty beautiful. But I want to be able to hear what you're saying. And I'm starting to lose the capacity to hear every message. Maybe you want to tell us, like, as if you tell us, you could go on another, like, tell us one more thing from the Book of Mormon, because there was a third and fourth thing that you said like connected this to the serpent, right? We did Helaman and we did Nephi 17.
We did second Nephi 9 and then or second Nephi 2 and then second Nephi 9. So yeah, so we hit them all. We got all the Book of Mormon points. The last thing I wanted to show you was that Genesis. And I think we for me, I mean, it's all interesting, but like one of the fun things is I think there's a much more colorful mythology than we realize. It's kind of been it's sort of filtered and sterilized. And I really do think that we're supposed to be seeing I mean that serpent story, as I recounted it, is what I think the Eden story is. And Satan is stripped of wings, defrocked, shattered, cursed, cast down to the earth. He's not the twin of Jesus. He looks like the twin of Jesus, right? He assumes that form by deception to beguile Eve. But the image is the two dueling serpents of Eden, and that is absolutely metal, and I love it. Well, I think we're gonna wind up here, as I think where Andreas was going. So sorry I didn't get a chance to look at everybody in the chat. But it sounds like we may have more opportunities to talk later. I look forward to it very much. What else? As long as I'm here, I'll go see what else is in the chat. Eat shrooms, find God. Maybe. I would not know. I have never eaten shrooms. The sword is in the rock, though. Excalibur. I like that. That's, don't underestimate how much ancient knowledge got passed down into the Middle Ages in the form of things like Arthurian stories or stained glass and old church windows. I eat dinosaur eggs like they're breakfast. Absolutely. Moses is Jesus, Yahshua. Well, that's interesting. Donna, excuse me. That's interesting. There are old Israelite texts where Moses has clearly been given roles that used to belong to the king. So one of them, for example, is I think it's called the exagoge of Ezekiel the Tragedian. I'm going to put this in the chat, and then I'm probably wrong, but I'm probably wrong about everything. Ezekiel the Tragedian. This is like a Hellenistic era playwriter. It's not Ezekiel from the book of Ezekiel. And it's basically sort of the Exodus as a play, but it shows Moses as the king enthroned in the Holy of Holies, which is super interesting because Moses, because then the figures of Moses and Jesus and the king kind of all start to bleed together. And second Isaiah, so second Isaiah's or Deutero Isaiah is Isaiah 40 to 55. Okay, that's the chapters we're talking about. Whether those really were written by somebody else, we don't know. But it's commonly thought those were not written by the person who wrote the first 39 chapters. Although really, if you read a detailed commentary, it's way more complex than that. It's not like Isaiah wrote 1 through 39 and then Isaiah Jr. wrote 40 to 55. It's more like Isaiah 1 through 39 is basically by one guy, but with later editing and changes, and right. And some of the second Isaiah stuff is probably older and brought forward. So there's a famous book by John Eaton where I'm forgetting the words, like festal kingship in Deutero Isaiah or something like that, where he argues that second Isaiah is a play and that it is a play about the king. It's a play that takes place in heaven, and the main character is the king, and it's associated with the fall festivals, with like the Day of Atonement or Sukkot. I'm reading now a commentary on Deutero Isaiah by a guy named Klaus Balzer, who basically says, yes, this is a play. Yes, it may even be associated with the fall festivals of Israel, but clearly it's not about the king. It is about Moses, right? So, Donna, this is kind of my point. Moses and Jesus both get assigned a lot of ideas or imagery that may be originally connected to or described or came from the kings of Judah, right? And so there is some interesting senses in which Moses equals Jesus equals Yahweh equals the king. There is something there. Andreas, should we sign off? Are you back to sign off?
Yeah, I think here I got my cell phone. So how's it going, buddy? Well, I really love this show, man. I can't believe you put up with all of this. The power of Christ compels you. That's obvious. Like, even
Correct.
with all of my technical difficulties, the demons couldn't get him. Let that be a lesson to all of you.
Correct. Thank you for having me on.
So I'm gonna, I'll set it off, but like, yeah, let's do another one soon. Hopefully this time with in the Silicon Valley, it'll have some better internet at that point.
Awesome. I look forward to it, buddy. Take care.
All right. Thanks, man. Love you.